everyone. Thank you for joining us for this presentation about CAS theory and the Cognitive Assessment System, second edition, which will be presented by Jack Naglieri. Dr. Naglieri is a research professor at the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia, emeritus professor at George Mason University, and senior research scientist at the Devereaux Center for Resilient Children. So we certainly have a very knowledgeable expert here to present. Thank you, Dr. Naglieri, and take it away.
Thank you so much. Again, I want to thank you, Francie, for making this happen, and I'm very pleased to be able to be here to talk about my work on CAS theory and cognitive assessment system. And just as we get started, you see that I have my Gmail account and my website here on this first page, and I'm happy to share the information today, but also in the future. So if this is being used by professors in months or years to come, you can always be in touch with me if you want me to zoom in and do a little follow-up. So it's a lot of fun for me. In terms of resources, there's a lot of information on my website. Nothing on my website costs anything. It's completely free. Copies of my articles, today's handout, there's a PDF of today's handout in the today's handout section, obviously. I have a lot of case studies. We've written a lot of short little pieces, 10-minute solutions like on dyslexia, for example, and article library and videos. And we're actually launching a lot of online webinars like this so people can access and just get more information. I will be talking about the various tests as we go and measures and books as we go through today. But I like to start by telling you like the conclusions, because I think it gives you a better idea of the big picture. So in my CAS theory, this is the simultaneous processing instruction that I'm giving you, the big picture. And so here's the big picture, a couple of things. First of all, as psychologists, one of the most important things that we do is a comprehensive assessment. And make no mistake about it, comprehensive assessment that you do will change a person's life. That's not an exaggeration. And that means this is really, really important. And if you think about particularly an intellectual assessment part of a comprehensive assessment, because obviously comprehensive means you look at personality and social issues and background and on and on and on and on, but we're just going to focus on the intellectual part. What do we really want from that intellectual part? Well, we want it to be consistent with IDEA. So, for example, IDEA defines a learning disability as a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes. Well, that means you should measure those. That means you should use a test that actually is designed to measure basic psychological processes. We certainly want to understand why a student fails. That's critically important, because unless we know why, we don't really know what to do. We don't really know what to tell the teacher. We might have answers, but they may not be really the answer. And we really want to look at academic and cognitive strengths and weaknesses. The academic and the intellectual processing weak strengths and weaknesses should be consistent. Talk a lot about that. And not last but least, but last but maybe most important, our tools have to be fair. And by fair, I mean not just psychometrically not biased, but also from the concept of equity. And I'll talk about that as we go through. So what I'm going to really talk about today is what I like to describe as second generation of ability tests. You know, you have the WISC, you have the Binet, the differential ability scales, the Woodcock cognitive, in some ways the KBC, but really the KBC is more like my cognitive assessment system. This is a second generation. When Kaufman's first started to talk about the KBC, they said, we know what the WISC is, we want to do it different. And that's what I did with my friend and colleague, J.P. Das. But the key is this. With the cognitive assessment system, we want to measure the way students think to learn. We're going to be talking a lot about that. And thinking should be defined on the basis of brain function. And so we have the CAS theory, which is a way of defining thinking, and the cognitive assessment system as a way of measuring the student's ability to think. So all this stuff needs to be connected. And those are the basic conclusions. And now I'm going to help you understand all the details and how we got here, and do it in 81 minutes we got left. So it might surprise you to know that I actually became very interested in how people learn in my first profession, which was not psychology at all. I was a professional musician. And I started playing professionally when I was 17. This was the first band I was ever in. This is a couple of years before I grew my beard. And one of the things I realized was when I taught guitar, which I did a lot of, using the same books and the same instruction, some kids got it, some kids didn't. And I was really puzzled, like, why is that? So I tried to find out, but didn't really get a clear answer. When I went off to undergraduate school, I really resonated with psychology, especially courses on learning, whether it was animal learning or human learning, notwithstanding. So then I started, after I got my school psych certificate, I started working as a school psychologist, and I noticed something really weird. I was working at this school, Charles Champagne Elementary in Bethpage, New York, where I was living, and I noticed that a lot of the questions on the WISC were just like the questions on the achievement test. There was an information subtest on the WISC. There was an information subtest on the Peabody Individual Achievement Test. There was a vocabulary test in both places. Sometimes the questions were virtually identical. It didn't make any sense to me, but I didn't know enough to know to say, it's not that it didn't make any sense. What I should have been saying is it's wrong. I say that today. It's wrong. I'm going to explain that some more. Now, after I got my PhD at the University of Georgia, I started my first job in Arizona. And I went to a lecture, like within the first month I was there, on Native American Navajos by a geneticist. And I thought, well, this guy must really know what he's talking about, right? Well, he started talking, and the more I listened to him, the more concerned I got, because he was saying, you know, the Native American Navajos, their left brains aren't as well developed as their right brains, because when you live on the desert, you have to have good spatial skills, and that's the right part of your brain, and the WISC measures the right part with the nonverbal test, and on and on and on. And then I started to think, I said, that's ridiculous. They don't speak English very well. Well, of course they're not going to get a high score on the verbal scale. So my first paper on this topic was, does the WISC-R really measure verbal intelligence for non-English speaking children? The answer obviously was no. Sometimes we miss the obvious. And this is where I really got interested in fair assessment. In 1982, my first paper, my first test, the matrix analogies test, was all about that. My first book on gifted is all about fair assessment. All the different iterations of my first test, they came the Naglieri nonverbal, now the third edition. And I've actually published more than a dozen tests, and all of these tests had equity in them, because we really need to do a better job. So what I'm trying to do here is take you from a place where you might be to another place in terms of your understanding. And I just want to play this great quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson. Give this a listen.
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong.
Think about that. Sometimes you have to know something so well and see it more realistically. And that's what I want to help you with today. So let's just step back for a second, just a minute or so. Why do we measure intelligence the way we do? Well, it's because of these guys. Thorndike, Otis of Otis Lennon, Woodworth. These men were responsible for the development of the Army Alpha and the Army Beta tests, published in 1917, more than 100 years ago. And that really was the foundation of the Wechsler scales. Because Wechsler was an examiner for the US military, and he gave the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, which became his verbal IQ and performance IQ. The problem is the verbal tests require lots and lots of language and knowledge. The nonverbal part, the beta tests, measure more thinking. The verbal tests really measure more knowledge. And this is really the foundation of all the group and individually administered traditional IQ tests. WISC, the DAST, the WJ, the COGAT, the Otis Lennon, they all have this fundamental flaw. And in this slide, I show all the different subtests from all these different instruments that we use all the time. We decide how smart somebody is on the basis of how many words they can define. Does that really make sense? Or how well they can do quantitative, math word problems or verbal analogies. Or even on the Woodcock, auditory processing, phonological processing. This doesn't make any sense to me. And if you go back and you read like writings in the early 70s, like this book that Joe Matarazzo published. Matarazzo worked a lot with Wechsler. I've known Joe for a long time. He's an amazing man. Even he said, look, vocabulary is influenced by educational opportunities. Arithmetic subtests, well, of course that's influenced by education. And then why do we have nonverbal tests? These are what they look like: object assembly, coding. Why do we have them? On page 19 of the Okerman Yerke's book on the Army Mental Testing Program, they explicitly say men who fail in alpha, that's the achievement kind of tests, are sent to beta, the nonverbal, in order that injustice by reason of unfamiliarity with English may be avoided. There's no talk about measuring verbal intelligence or nonverbal intelligence. They really saw the nonverbal test as a way of managing this social justice issue. And especially in our world today, with all the stuff that's going on with the Black Lives Matter and all the social upheaval about fairness for everyone, this is something we need to pay more attention to. We were told this 100 years ago, but I never learned it in any of my training programs. Alan Kaufman was my teacher at the University of Georgia. He was the first one who said the verbal side of the WISC could also be considered an achievement test. And he was right. The tests that we have kind of on a continuum. So the achievement tests on the right-hand side and the ability tests that don't involve achievement on the leftmost side. And the stuff in the middle is where you get misled. like a Wilcox-Johnson, Otis Lennon, a Kogat, a Whisk, you get misled. You think they're not so smart, but it's just that they haven't had opportunity, even if they only speak English. So with the cognitive assessment system, the Wechsler nonverbal, which I am the author of, my test of general ability, Bruce Bracken and Steve McCallan's test of unit, Don Hamill has a nonverbal matrices test. These are the kinds of tests that measure thinking. And that's where we need to recognize we can do better. We can do a better job of evaluating ability if we move away from traditional IQ tests. It's time to move on. So, if we're going to make this shift from traditional to second generation intelligence tests, what will we need to do? Well, this is the question that I discussed with my friend J.P. Das in 1984. When we first met to talk about how we could reinvent the concept of intelligence as a neurocognitive process. And we began the development of the cognitive assessment system. There we are, 1984, in our first meeting in Tucson, Arizona. We conceptualized intelligence or basic psychological processes or abilities, or whatever term you want to use, as planning, attention, simultaneous and successive neurocognitive processes based on Luria's concept of brain function. Brain function is what we're going to discuss. Here's what we looked like when we published in '97 the first edition of the CAS, and here's what we looked like shortly after we published the second edition. You can see we got a little bit older, obviously. JP is actually 19 years older than me, and still a wonderful, extraordinary, brilliant, and kind human being. We've obviously been friends for a really long time. So let me tell you about the past neurocognitive theory. Sounds sophisticated, neurocognitive theory, but look at the definitions. Planning is the first part of the past theory, thinking about how you do what you decide to do. Attention, being alert and resisting distractions. Simultaneous, getting the big picture. Successive processing, following a sequence. Past equals basic psychological processes as described in the IDEA law. But notice something. There's no psychobabble here. You can explain these four abilities to anybody. This is a strength of the past theory. Despite the fact that it's incredibly sophisticated and powerful, it's easy to explain. You don't have to have some kind of fancy words or fancy terms to describe things. It's clear. You know, I've explained this to 8-year-olds, 7-year-olds, our granddaughter, 6-year-olds. We talk to her about planning. And remember, you want to be able to explain it to students, because ultimately, that's your most important person to tell. If you want to read about all the neuropsychological stuff, you can read these 2 chapters out of these books on my website. Tulio Otero and I put these together if you really want to get into the neuropsych. But let's start by just reviewing Luria's conceptualization of 3 functional units of the brain. First functional unit is the base of the brain. That's for attention, resistance to distraction. The second functional unit, the back part of the brain, that's for occipital-parietal for simultaneous, temporal for successive. And then the front part of the brain, of course, that's what we call planning. We also think of it as executive function, metacognition, similar words, similar descriptions. So let's talk about each of these processes in turn here. Planning. So planning is a term that describes a neurocognitive function, as I said, similar related to metacognition or executive functioning. It's used when you have to set a goal, make decisions. When you're wondering, what's going to happen next? Well, what will somebody else do? It's also very much related to impulse control, strategy use. You know, sometimes retrieval of knowledge is a really good strategy. So you might be thinking, that sounds like ADHD kids. Well, yeah, it is. And we'll take a look at that in a little while. In simple terms, this is what helps us make decisions about how to solve any kind of a problem. And we often think of solving problems at school, but it's more than just school. It's outside of school. It's social, social-emotional. I actually like, instead of social-emotional learning or social-emotional competence, I like to talk about social-emotional cognition. Because social-emotional behaviors, if you will, are an expression of cognition. And of course, academics and lots of it. So how do you measure planning? Well, what you do is you give a student a relatively easy task and see if they spontaneously on their own decide to use a strategy. Because strategy use is evidence of thinking about how you're going to do what you do. So Jack Jr., who's now 30, when I gave him this very simple little task, I explained to him that he had to put XO under the A's and OO under the B's, and XX under the C's. And I said to him, after I explained the task, I showed it to him, he said, you can do it any way you want. So he did the A's, then he did the B's, and then he started the C's. So I just stopped him because clearly, this wasn't a real test, it was just the illustration. But to show that he was thinking strategically. And that's what we want to get at with all the planning tests on the CAS. And we have a CAS2 rating scale for teachers. And the reason I like to show this is because these are the kind of behaviors that teachers can observe that help the teacher get a sense of where is the child on these 4 basic psychological processes. But by the way, it also teaches the teachers about what PASS is. But if you look at some of the questions, like have many ideas about how to do things, solve a problem with a new solution when the old one doesn't work. These kind of behaviors are related to planning. Now, I'm going to show you 2 really important videos here. The first is our granddaughter Samantha. Now she's 9 years old, but here she was only 13 months old, and she was not speaking, and she couldn't walk unless she held on to something. So I'm sitting in the foreground here, and watch how I say to her, come to me, Samantha, watch how she does it. Now, you might have noticed that she was planning, but let's look at it one more time. Look where she let go of the table. She was anticipating what was going to happen next. And she realized she couldn't just walk to me. So she anticipates what's going to happen, and she gets down, crawls, and comes to me. In the next video, here, now she's older, and my daughter Andrea now is using her planning and saying, I'm afraid Samantha is going to think she can just walk down the steps and fall. So what she does, my daughter, is teach Samantha to go down on her belly, feet first. So here she is. She's at the top of the 14 steps, and she's coming around, and, okay, she hit something. I'm encouraging her, come on, you can do it. And she's looking around. She looks all the way down. I'm sure she's saying to herself, maybe this isn't such a good idea, you know. But she doesn't start to cry. She doesn't lose her emotional control. She's trying to stay, more or less, so she doesn't roll down the log. But she's looking around. She's coming down. She comes all the way down, and then eventually she gets down to the bottom. So this is the intersection of knowledge and planning. And this is very, very important concept that I evolved from some of the work of Nick Goldberg in his book on executive function. Whenever we're in a novel situation, like our world today, everything's different, right? Well, that's when PASS, but especially planning, becomes really important. Because we can't just do things based upon knowing how to do things, because now we have to learn all kinds of new things. How do you really use Zoom? What do you do if people can't, hear the audio? Blah, blah, blah. Do you keep going, or do you try to fix it? Everything's new. And once a task is learned, then there's not as much processing involved. So if you think about what we call fluency is when you do it without really thinking. Learning is when you only can do it by thinking. When you start to learn something new, that's when PASS is really important. If you have a weakness in one of those 4 areas, and if the instruction particularly demands one of those 4 areas, you will have trouble. So if you're not good in successive processing, working with things in sequence, and you're being taught reading with a phonics approach, when you need to use your brain the most, when you don't have any knowledge about reading, it's going to be really hard. Okay, let's take a few more steps. Any kind of strategy use that involves planning. And there's a lot of really good instruction that involves strategy use, but unfortunately, teachers, I don't think, understand the value of explaining to students about strategies in general. Because we really don't want to teach a strategy. We want to encourage the use of strategies, especially those that students think of themselves, because those will generalize more. So let's talk about attention next. So attention is a basic psychological process that we use to selectively attend to some stimuli and ignoring others. So focus and resist. Focus and resist. You can call it selective attention. It's harder over time. The more you have to concentrate, the harder it gets. Just think about when you're driving in a car. After a while, it gets hard to focus your attention. And of course, resistance to distraction. So if you're, I'm often reminded of when my 3 kids were young and we were driving for a long period of time, and the kids are, and the music, Little Mermaid's playing for the girls, and there's cars all around. It's really hard to focus on the road and resist this distraction. That's a real life example of attention in the real world. But also things like listening as opposed to hearing. And you can hear, but not really listening. All those kinds of things. Now, one way that we can measure attention is with this very traditional Stroop test. Why Stroop? Because in this example, where you see this word red, but you have to say yellow. Red is more salient if you read than the color. So it creates a conflict. And it's that conflict, it's really at the point of expression. That's why we call this test on the CAS2 expressive attention. Because that's the point when it's really hard to figure out what you want to say. Now, in these versions of the test, in the Italian version and in the Korean version, these are really easy for us because the stimuli have lost their 2-dimensionality. it's just squiggly lines in color. It's easy to say blue, green, yellow, and so on. The cognitive demands of the task change as the context, in this case, the knowledge required changes. So for the attention scale, we ask the teachers, does the child work well in a noisy environment? Can they stay on task and listen carefully? Pay attention. By the way, multiple choice tests are really hard if you have the inattentive type of ADHD. Those individuals do perform poorly explicitly on the attention scale on the CAS. And why are multiple choice questions so hard? Because the answers are so similar, right? Look, 6:22 a.m., 5:22 p.m., 6:22 p.m. So the difference between the correct answer, D, and the first one you see, A, is just that the D has the PM and A has AM. So if you ever have a child with inattentive type of ADHD, you really got to help them with these multiple choice tests, preferably make it so they don't have to take them. That would be the best option. Okay, let's look at successive processing now. This is all about sequencing. Recall of anything in order, words, letter, word correspondence, any kind of phonics, phonological tasks. You know, lots of times people say, well, a child has a learning disability because they have a phonological awareness weakness. That's why they have dyslexia. And my response to that is no. The failure of a task of phonological knowledge is because they can't sequence. Phonological is the symptom, not the cause. That's why if you have kids with dyslexia and you try to teach them all the phonics stuff, that's not going to help because their problem is sequencing of sounds, not the phonological piece. Steve Pfeiffer and I have written a lot about this topic. You can measure that with simple recall of numbers, pretty straightforward. And we have this really totally awesome subtest that I think is the greatest. We want to get at syntax because syntax demands sequencing, and that's what successive processing is all about. So we have for the little kids a sentence repetition, which is really funny because it has just weird words. So we say to the child, the red, green, the blue with the yellow. And the child has to repeat that perfectly for credit. So it's all about the syntax. But for the 8-year-olds and above, we do this. The red, green, the blue with a yellow. Who got greened? So now you really have to decipher the sequence of the syntax of the sentence in order to arrive at the answer. Now, we don't use a real sentence like the boy hit the girl with a stick. Who got hurt? Because when you hear that, that's easier to pull together as a whole. So that's a powerful successive processing test. And successive processing on the rating scale gets at sounding out hard words, repeating long words, repeat sentences, and so on. All right. By the way, handwriting, very much related to successive processing. A colleague of mine called me about this young man who was in an alternative high school, actually in Denver, not far from where you all are. And she asked me if we could understand this horrible penmanship from past theory, and I said yes. And then she said, well, you know what? We have CAS scores on this boy. And look, young man, I should say, 90 in planning, 93 simultaneous, 103 attention, 55 standard score, successive processing. Remember, this is a mean of 100 and SD of 15. This is a young adult with a tremendous learning disability. And it showed up in his handwriting and other things. All right, finally, simultaneous, getting the big picture. Like I said to you before, we want to get the big picture here. Integration of information into a whole, where everything has to be related to everything else. Like Gestalt, and remember when you learned Gestalt psychology? That's really all about simultaneous processing, seeing patterns, seeing relationships, patterns in geometry, patterns in words, verbal concepts, all that kind of stuff. We have an awesome verbal spatial relations test, we call it. So the question is, which picture shows the boy behind a girl? So what's going on with that? You have to decipher the relationships of those people in space. That's what makes this so simultaneous processing dense. And the rating scale gets at things like likes to draw designs, works well with patterns, physical objects, and so on. Recognizes faces easily. But I want to show you something really interesting now, because I want to share this, come back to this notion of thinking versus knowing. So the item on the left, the progressive matrix, I mean, this demands simultaneous processing. This is one, like one of the subtests on the cognitive assessment system, and my Naglieri non-verbal, by the way. So you don't have to say the white circle in the top row becomes a blue circle when you go to the right. So a white square in the bottom left should be a blue square in the bottom right. You could say all that stuff, but you really don't have to, right? All you need to do is look at the relationships or the pattern to know that that's the correct answer. But how about this? Girl is to woman as boy is to man. Isn't that the same kind of girl is to woman as boy is to man? See that? It's really like the relationships are still there. Or how about this? 3 is to 6 as 4 is to 8. But here's the one that illustrates how you can't think unless you have the knowledge. C7 is to F as E7 is to. If you're a musician, you know the answer is A major. So even though all 4 of these questions demand the same kind of thinking, they do not require the same amount of knowing. And that is the fundamental problem with traditional IQ tests. They're like giving you a music test and then deciding how smart you are. I do want to just briefly tell you one thing. You've probably heard a lot about visual and auditory, right? And a lot of regs, visual processing, auditory processing, and all that kind of jazz. Well, you know what? It's not how the brain works. There's a part, once the information gets processed in your brain, it loses any kind of modality tag at the heteromodal association cortex. So when someone says to you, oh, this child is good in visual, spatial, they probably mean simultaneous processing. Or when they say this student is really struggling in auditory processing, they're probably referring to a task that requires successive processing. And I've actually analyzed visual and auditory processing tests, and that's exactly what we find, the correspondence between all those different kinds of tests and these two processes. So again, one of the greatest challenges in our world today is knowing enough about a topic to think you're right, but not enough about a topic to know you're wrong. And that certainly applies to the modality concept. And I was taught modality by Rita Dunn in the 70s, who is one of the leading people in the entire modality field. All right, how do you know if a test requires thinking or knowing? It's easy. All you have to do is say, what does the student need to know to complete the task? If there's a bunch of things they have to know, it's knowledge confounded at least. How do they have to think? If they need to use a plan, if they need to focus their attention, resist distraction, or see how things go together, or sequence. That's basically it. All right, let's take a couple of more steps. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the tests themselves, just basically to say that with a second edition, I expanded the test out to include different versions. So we have the traditional 8 subtest or 12 subtest versions of the CAS, but we added the Spanish CAS. We have a brief version, which is very good as a screening tool, or when you just need 20 minutes, you want to get a quick look at a kid, find out what's going on, and then the rating scales. So these are the various options based upon, you could think of it as where you are in tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or what kind of needs you have. But that's what the tests are designed. They're designed to be used in a number of different contexts by a number of different people. A lot of special ed and teachers are using the CAS2 brief and the rating scale respectively. A lot of psychs are using the rating scale as a follow-up or a screener. We are working on a digital CAS. It's actually just about done. So I'm really excited about that. We do have online scoring and report writing, so you really don't have to do, put the raw scores in and you get your report. You can copy and paste and do whatever you want with it. It's an unlimited use. It really works well. The CAS2 brief, all the scores are mean of 100 and SD of 15, only 4 subtests, as it should be. The actual directions are on the record form, and the CAS2 rating scale is pretty straightforward. CAS2 Espanol, as I mentioned, you can get a lot more information on all these tools and how to use them, and chapters on administration, scoring, all the details of all the jazz, that comes with this in the book that Tulio and I wrote, Essentials of CAS2 Assessment. So I encourage you to take a look at that. We really need to talk about this thinking and knowing a little bit more. But I want to show you a case I think illustrates it really well. So this is a case that Tulio brought to my attention about a year or so ago. That's not really the boy's picture, but I always like to have a picture when I talk about the case. Alejandro having difficulty in school, teacher wondering, is it attention deficit? He's kind of not really cooperative, on and on and on. So Tulio gives achievement test and the WISC, and look what he found. Scores between the 70s and 80s on both tests. Now, it is very reasonable to say this young man is doing the best he can. That's very reasonable if you believe the WISC measures all that should be measured. But look at the CAS scores. Planning of 102, very average. Simultaneous, 96, very average. Successive, kind of on the borderline, 84, right? About 15th percentile. Attention, 67. Inattentive type of ADHD. The discussion in the meeting with all the staff at the eligibility was, is he intellectually disabled or not? Answer is no. But the different test changes the view of the same child in a very dramatic way. Think of the difference, how you would feel about this was your own child. Your expectations would be different. You'd be pretty confused, really, in a lot of ways, because you'd probably be saying, I don't really know that he seems like he's more capable, but his achievement scores don't show that. All these, in the Essentials book, we have tons of cases. They're all real. We don't have to change any numbers to make it look good or pick just the right kids to make a point. We have case after case after case like this. This is what happens when you really change your view. When you really understand what you have, and you really understand what you could have. And I just want to point out one more thing. They're going to move ahead here. Notice that full-scale scores, it's crossed out. Because the full-scale score doesn't matter. What matters is these individual scores. CAS is really, there's really 4 tests in one. I mean, that's really what it is. It's really about measuring 4 separate abilities. So what we really have with Alejandro is a learning disability. And in my discrepancy consistency method, what we do is we illustrate his pattern of strengths and weaknesses in a triangle. I started doing this in 1997. Other people have adopted my triangle. But here's why it's important. You have significant differences among the PASS scores. In other words, he's not equally capable across the 4 basic psychological processes. He's got strengths in simultaneous and planning, weaknesses in attention and successive. He's got significant discrepancy between good cognition and bad academics. That's a traditional ability achievement discrepancy. But his consistency answers the question, why does he fail? It's not a coincidence. His low attention scores and successive is what's driving these academic failure. And unless you answer that question, why he fails, you don't know what to do with him. And Tullio has just shown me another case recently where the intervention was simply they explained to the student about the need to really pay attention carefully when struggling. They used a graphic from my Helping Children Learn book, which is a little graphic that says, think smart, look at the details. They put that, scotch taped that to the kid's desk. And the teacher reported like a week later, how much better the student was doing. Simple little intervention had a real powerful impact. So if you really understand what's wrong, you'll be more able to help students. And remember this, the first step should be tell the student what you found. You don't need to worry about the student not understanding because you can explain it in kid language. It's not hard. What happens when you do that? All of a sudden the kid says, yeah, that's right. I just can't concentrate. And you say, I know, but I know how to help you. Think smart. Look at the details. Think smart. Use a plan. Use your good planning. Use your front part of your brain. And you explain the brain to kids. They can get it. You want to bring the kids into the solution. Once you've done that, that's a life-changing event. Because if you tell the teacher, your kid has a different teacher next year, then who knows if they're going to read your report in 2 years like that. But when you help a student understand his or her own strengths and weaknesses, that makes a bigger difference. So that's really the key. So you intentionally teach the student, talk to them about their brain, talk to them about using sequences, use my Helping Children Learn book. There's lots and lots of strategies in there, and that'll make a big difference. Little research update. I know we have Saturday Night Live update, but this is just the G update and a couple other things. Now, I want to talk about equity for a moment. And I encourage you to take a look at the standards for educational and psychological assessment, the AERA, APA. When I was on the committee for psychological tests and assessment, we talked a lot about this issue of test bias versus equitable assessment. Test bias usually described as psychometric bias. And lots of times people will say, oh, we've taken all of the test bias out of our test. But they don't talk about the equitable assessment piece. And I'm thinking of explicit people, actually, when I say that. But here's what this standard says. If a person has had limited opportunities to learn the content in a test of intelligence, that test may be considered unfair because it penalizes students for not knowing the answers, even if the norming data do not demonstrate test bias. So in other words, when you read in a test manual, oh, we studied test bias and we don't have any differential item functioning, we have similar factor structure, blah, 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 item gradients, and so on and so forth, but they don't ever talk about the impact, meaning mean score differences, and not really covering the whole issue. Because that's what really impacts kids the most. And that's why I want to show you this summary of data, also from my Essentials book. I pulled together all that we know about these different tests. They're all the details about where I got these data are in the footnote or in my book. The only studies that I did were the CAS and the KBC. All the others were done by other people, and they have different methodologies. Sometimes they're matched samples. Sometimes they're just normative sample, which represents the US population. Sometimes they're statistical controls. Well, if you see all the traditional tests, where they are, and then you come down, you look at the KBC normative sample, the KBC match. This was my study. I published the study in 1985. I was the only person to do a study on the black-white study on the KBC. The KBC2 match samples, the CAS2, CAS, and CAS2. And you can see, once you move away from traditional IQ, the difference between blacks and whites goes down considerably. That's really important. I'll tell you a little bit more. We can do better. Here's what you get for Hispanics, basically the same difference. Hispanic and non-Hispanic differences on PASS in the cognitive assessment system, basically the same, 4.8. Interestingly, when you give the CAS in English or Spanish, you get the same results. Not only do you get the same results in terms of mean scores, you get the same decisions. Over 90% of the time, your decision about whether the student had a strength or a weakness in PASS is the same. That's because we're measuring thinking, not knowing. And we replicated that study, got the same results. All these studies are on my website. You can go and read them. I'll just tell you, there's a really interesting court case in Elgin, Illinois, that had to do with gifted. You know, I do a lot of work with fair assessment of gifted kids. I'm actually going to publish 3 tests for gifted next year. And in this particular court case, the judge, well, to give you a little bit of background, the district is 42% Hispanics, only 2% of gifted kids were Hispanic. Something's wrong, right? So what the judge determined was that the district intentionally discriminated against Hispanic students by placing too much emphasis on verbal and math test scores to get into gifted program. Even though they gave my Naglieri nonverbal, basically they ignored it. So a student with a really high score on a nonverbal test couldn't get in because they didn't have high verbal scores. This test has a lot of implications for us. This court case, there's a lot of implications for us because we do this all the time when you give traditional IQ tests. And I think it's just plain wrong. In this particular paper that I published in the Journal of Mental Retardation 2001, 20 years ago, we showed how, in fact, you're more likely to put a black kid in a class for intellectual disabled if they were given a WISC than if they're given a CAS. Because the WISC scores have lower VI verbal scales, which bring down the full scale, which gets the kids in that designation. This is a social justice issue that we've been talking about the whole day here. Now, interestingly, in California, there was a legal opinion rendered, and this is the legal opinion that the CAS, because it doesn't rely on knowledge, and it's not an IQ test, really, that it was acceptable for assessment of children in California. So again, you can read this on my website, read all the details. Now, what about G? There's a lot of research out there that says all of these tests, like the WISC, the WJ, Stanford-Binet, and so on, should only be interpreted at the full-scale level because the amount of variance that is accounted for by the scales is not sufficient to be interpreted. Said in plain English, this research says the only score you should interpret on, for example, a Stanford-Binet, a Woodcock Cognitive, or a WISC is the full scale, the total score. Of course, the parts really don't have specific variance. This is just a list of some of the research that these guys have done. This is controversial because a lot of people who have been advocating for interpretation of scales on all these different tests don't like it, but there's a lot of research here that says a lot of consistency, that you should only be interpreting the full scale, except for, you know what test? Fine. The same author, Gary Canavay, who's done all these other studies, found that compared to the WISC, the WACE, the Stanford-Binet, and so on and so on and so forth, the CAS scales do have enough variance to be interpreted. And if you think about it, I mean, this is a really important finding. And I've known Gary for a long time, and I actually gave him my standardization sample data. I trusted him to tell me what was. I'm like, Gary, just tell me what you find. Whatever it is, I'm going to live with it. But I want to know. And this is what he said. So I encourage you to take a look at that paper. It doesn't mean that there's not some higher order, but that there's also the lower order. So take a look at the paper. Now, if in fact we're going to interpret scales, the next really important question is there evidence that there are actually profiles on PASS? And do those profiles make sense? And do PASS scores really relate to achievement? So more research is needed. Well, let me show you what I've found. In a couple of different book chapters, I've summarized again. I go to all the resources, find the research, summarize it. That's all I'm doing here. And in this slide, there's a lot of information here, but here's what I did. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 studies that have been done on children with reading decoding failure. These are the dyslexic children. Dyslexic children are the ones with the reading decoding failure. On the WISC, they're above 85 on everything, a little low on working memory, but WISC-5, WISC-4, pretty much similar pattern. On the WJ, you get this, everything is 90 or above. KBC, everything's flat. But look at the CAS. The student who can't do reading decoding, can't do phonological tasks, can't do those things because the successive processing is so low. It's the successive processing that's the weakness. That's the disorder in basic psychological processing that's manifested in poor reading decoding and related skills like spelling and so on and so forth. Remembering things in order, speech articulation, handwriting, tying your shoes, remembering the combination to your locker, all that kind of stuff. Now, these data are really important, but it's not enough. What other group do we often have difficulty differentiating from LD kids, specific SLD kids? ADHD. So what do children with ADHD look like? That's the next set of data. So children with ADHD on the WISC-5 and the WISC-4, everything's good. In other words, the WISC-5 and the WISC-4 doesn't reveal any cognitive explanation for the behaviors related to ADHD. Neither does the WJ, neither does the KBC. The CAS sure does. Now, you might say, well, ADHD, isn't that a failure of attention? Well, not really, because ADHD is about, as Russell Barkley talks about it, is about failure of executive function, a frontal lobe disorder. The inattentive type is a failure in attention. But the typical ADHD student, that student with ADHD is struggling because they're poor in planning, and we've found this in several of our studies. The good news is you can really help them. I'm going to show you, that's going to be the last couple of slides. I'm going to show you my research, how you can actually help students with ADHD and LD do better in academics and on standardized achievement tests and generalized to over time. We'll get there. But this is a lot of information right here. These profiles are really, really important. And they tell us that students vary on profiles on the CAS. The profiles really don't vary very much from other tests. Now, the only thing that kind of comes out is working memory on the WISC for kids with reading decoding failure. But remember, part of the working memory scale is digits forward. And digits forwards is successive processing. So there's a little bit of a, I mean, it's not a very clean measurement, but it's a little bit there. Look at the WJ. You know, this is CHC. This is really troubling because basically it's not differentiating these kids at all. And these are data that come right out of the WJ. KBC is also troubling. I wish the KBC worked, but I'm not seeing any evidence of it. And look at how different the profiles are on the CAS. There's a lot of other really good research on profiles. And I encourage you to take a look at these. The one that looked at profiles for the entire standardization sample, especially important. Mine, we looked at relationship between profiles and whether or not you wound up in special ed or not. Find out if you had a significant profile on the past theory, you're more likely to have been previously identified as needing special ed. That was pretty crazy. And a lot of other different kinds of profiles, different kind of profiles for different kinds of children, like the study that Judy Johnson did looking at students with written expression disabilities, finding there are different kinds of patterns. These patterns matter. PASS, these scores matter. Now, when I looked at all these profiles, I thought, wow, this is crazy. There's a lot of variability going on there. I wonder how well the CAS scores really correlate with achievement, because, that's kind of like a basic validity question. In fact, I have to tell you, when I first started publishing my research on black-white differences, for example, some people said, well, you don't get the differences that other people find because your test is less valid. That really irritated me. But perhaps the most compelling evidence of validity is correlation to achievement. But I have a problem if I want to do a research study in that area, because if I want to compare the WISC correlation to achievement, or the Stanford-Binet to achievement, or the WJ to achievement, and the CAS to achievement, well, all those other tests have achievement in them. Vocabulary, information, arithmetic, I don't have that in the CAS. So I have a disadvantage. But I did the research anyway, and let me show you what I found. Really interestingly, in this, again, summarized in my Essentials book with Tullio, when you look at the WISC-5, the WJ Cognitive, the KBC, the CAS always correlates higher than any of these tests with achievement, and it doesn't have achievement in it. So it's definitely more valid as a predictor of academic achievement. But then more recently, a meta-analysis was just published. And this meta-analysis, just published in the Journal of Intelligence by George Giorgio, he showed clearly that the correlations between these 60-something studies, that the correlations were significantly stronger than correlations reported in previous meta-analyses for all other measures of intelligence. So my collection of research and this meta-analyses of all the research, because there's a lot of research on past theory out there, a lot, clearly shows that, as Giorgio concluded, if we conceptualize intelligence as cognitive processes that are linked to the functional organization of the brain, it leads to significantly high relationships with academic achievement. And these processes have direct implications for instruction and intervention. We can do better. Eligibility determination. This is the case of Rocky, a real, not really Rocky, but a real boy. A little boy who had to suffer, unfortunately. He actually went to school close to where I live in Northern Virginia, at a very good district with very good school psychologists. First grade, he was significantly below benchmarks. He was struggling. They got him all kinds of help. Middle of the second, and they retained him. Bad intervention, retention. By the middle of the second year in the first grade, he was still struggling and feeling bad about himself and having trouble focusing and paying attention and so on and so forth. So after 2 years of special team meetings, what was happening was they were really pushing RTI, and they just wanted to RTI and RTI and RTI and not test him. If they had given him the CAS2 brief a couple of months after he started with interventions, they would have found his weakness. And they would have found out that, wow, we need to do something more than RTI. Because he had a 76 on the successive processing and a 72 on his planning scale, with 101 in simultaneous 98 on attention with academic weaknesses. This is a really, really bad combination. Whenever you have a planning weakness and something else, because that means when you get stuck, you can't figure out what you need to do. Planning is how you do what you do. So what are you likely to do? What's most likely to happen when a student's trying to read and they're not being successful and they don't have a good plan, they get anxious, they stop and go do something else. So you remember that that's a negative reinforcement paradigm, right? Because you reduced the anxiety by withdrawing from the situation. But when we help the student understand, yes, it's going to be hard, but we can help you do better, that'll make a difference. Now, I'm going to come back to that topic, but I want you to know that on my website, you can get these free achievement PASS score analyzers for all the different achievement tests that are out there. All you have to do is you put in the 4 scores from the cognitive assessment system and the achievement test, whichever achievement test you use, and it'll do all the comparisons. It'll test the significance of the difference between each PASS score and all the different achievement scores, tell you if they're consistent or just significantly discrepant or not, and build the triangle that I've been talking to you about. It happens in a flash. It's all free, and it's there for all the achievement tests. I suggest you use Pfeiffer's assessments of reading, math, and writing because his 3 tests are very closely keyed or tied to PASS. So, for example, in his reading comprehension subtest, part of what you find out is, does the student use a strategy or not? So you have a student who has a low planning score, and they're doing poorly in reading comprehension because they're not using a strategy. It all fits together beautifully. So if you don't use Steve's tests, that's fine, but use the other academic tasks. Little side note here. I'm really concerned because of what's happened in our world in the last 8 months that a lot of achievement test norms are going to be inaccurate. Because the students today, I don't think they've had the benefit of the education that students would typically have. And another advantage of Steve's tests is because he does get at not only what they're doing, but how they do it. So it's something that we need to learn more about. So I just tell you that to think about it and be on the lookout for more discussions on this topic as everything evolves in the months and hopefully not the years to come in this regard. So for Rocky, what we do is we talk to him about overcoming anxiety. We talk to him about using segmenting, because segmenting is a way of making successive chains easier to manage, chunking for reading, decoding, and so on. These handouts are in my book. You're allowed to reproduce them. You're allowed to give them away. It's not a copyright infringement. It says right on every handout, it's for students, parents, and teachers. You can reproduce for educational purposes. Now, one of the handouts for this case is planning facilitation for math calculation. I've published a line of research on this methodology called planning facilitation, not planning instruction, because you don't actually teach kids to be strategic. You encourage them to understand the value of a strategy. Now, this particular study of Jackie Eisman's was, I want you to look at the title, Cognitive Strategy Instruction to Improve Math Calculation for Children with ADHD and LD. All these students had both problems. And look, it's a randomized control study published in the Journal of Learning Disabilities. You don't get in the Journal of Learning Disabilities unless you do things well. And Jackie did, this was her dissertation. So what did we have? We had an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group got this planning facilitation method, which I'll explain to you in a moment. The control group got more math instruction. So we're comparing a cognitive intervention to additional explicit instruction in math taken from their curriculum as all these test questions that the kids did. That's how we tested them pre-post. That's where they all came from. Anyway, what did we find? What did we do? The planning, or you could call it metacognitive strategy instruction, teaches facilitated discussions. It's like solution-focused counseling. The teachers just ask questions. What was your goal? Where did you start? What strategies did you use? What will you do next time? And the students in the whole class would hear the other kids say things like, my goal was to do the easy problems first. Okay, nothing wrong with that. I did my problems and I checked my work. Oh, okay. I draw lines to keep the columns straight. That's a good way of organizing it. And I did the ones that took the least amount of time. Okay, that's efficiency. That's reasonable. But what did we find? We found that when we looked at these math worksheets taken directly from the curriculum of that school, the kids who were encouraged, who received the experimental group, improved dramatically, the normal group a little bit. The Wyatt numerical operation scores, the experimental group improved better than the normal instruction. Same thing for math fluency. A year later, we went back and we pulled the achievement test scores out of the files, then current. The experimental group was still better than the comparison group. A year later, we were never in the school in that year. This simple intervention made a profound difference in these students' performance. And there's a bunch of research on this, related research on cognitive interventions.
Thank you so much for your time. This was incredibly helpful.